The story everyone thinks they know might have ended before it ever began. What if the royal wedding watched by billions around the world was never meant to last? What if the tears, the vows, the fairy tale imagery were not a beginning, but a carefully staged midpoint? And what if the one person who knew that all along was the bride's own father? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the public was told a simple story, a love story, a modern romance that challenged tradition, defied an ancient institution, and collapsed under the weight of cruelty and intolerance. It was emotional, it was cinematic, it was persuasive. But today, a very different claim is emerging. One that doesn't just challenge the ending of that story, but questions whether the ending was written long before the opening scene. Because according to Thomas Markle, the departure from royal life was not a reaction. It was not heartbreak. It was not escape. It was a plan, and not a last-minute one. Let that sink in for a second. If this claim is true, even partially true, then everything changes. The engagement, the wedding, the interviews, the alleged mistreatment, the timing of the exit, even the role Prince Harry himself played in the story. Ask yourself this: can you truly leave something unexpectedly if you already know where the door is and when you plan to walk through it? That's the question hanging over this entire saga now. For years, Thomas Markle was framed as a liability, a messy footnote, an embarrassment to be managed, silenced, or dismissed. He was the father who talked too much, the man who staged photos, the voice that didn't fit the carefully curated image of a global icon stepping into royalty. And yet, despite the media storms, despite the estrangement, despite the global backlash, Thomas went quiet. Really quiet. No daily interviews, no constant counter-narratives, no tell-all book. That silence alone raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a man accused of seeking attention suddenly disappear when attention was at its peak? According to him, it wasn't fear, it wasn't guilt, it was restraint. And restraint suggests knowledge. Thomas now claims that long before the wedding bells rang, long before the carriage rolled through cheering crowds, long before the world watched a prince pledge his future, he already knew his daughter would not remain inside the royal family. Not might not was struggling, but would not. She never intended to stay, he claims. 1993, it was all part of the plan. That sentence alone detonates the entire public narrative. Because if intent existed before commitment, then the commitment itself becomes something else entirely. Not a promise, but a performance. Not a leap of faith, but a calculated step. And suddenly, the timeline we've all accepted starts to wobble. Think back to the engagement interviews, the glowing optimism, the wide smiles, the insistence that this love story was different, modern, unbreakable. Now ask yourself, why did exit discussions begin so quickly after the wedding? Why did tensions escalate at such speed? Why did so many bridges burn at once? Were these growing pains? Or were they pressure points, deliberately pushed? Thomas suggests there was a moment, a conversation, a realization that made it clear the royal role was never meant to be permanent. A moment when he stopped offering advice because he understood advice was no longer relevant. If you're watching this and feeling conflicted, that's the point. This isn't about proving anyone right or wrong yet. This is about confronting the possibility that we've been analyzing reactions when we should have been analyzing intentions. Because intentions change everything. They change how we interpret interviews. They change how we interpret grievances. They change how we interpret Harry's position, whether as a co-architect of the exit or a passenger who didn't know where the journey was headed until the doors closed behind him. And most unsettling of all, they force us to ask whether the royal family was reacting to chaos or being maneuvered into a role they were always meant to play: the villain. Because every exit plan needs one. But here's where the story gets even darker. Thomas claims he didn't just suspect an exit. He claims he understood how it would happen. That blame would be assigned. That conflict would be framed. That sympathy would be mobilized. If that's true, then the silence that followed wasn't absence. It was waiting. Waiting for the moment when speaking would matter more than being believed. And now that moment, according to him, has arrived. But the most disturbing part of his claim isn't about Meghan. It's about Harry, because if an exit plan existed before the wedding, then someone entered that marriage under very different assumptions than the other. And according to Thomas, the person who paid the highest emotional price didn't realize it until it was far too late. But the question that changes everything is this: if a plan existed before the vows were spoken, who else knew? And who didn't? Because what came next would change not just a marriage, but the way the world understands every single moment that followed. If a plan existed before the vows were spoken, who else knew? And just as important, who didn't? Because once you start asking that question, the entire fairy tale begins to fracture. The problem with modern royal narratives is that they are designed to feel emotional before they feel logical. They move fast. They overwhelm you with feeling. They dare you to choose sides before you have time to ask follow-up questions. And for years, that's exactly how this story was consumed. A lonely prince, a misunderstood woman, an institution portrayed as cold, archaic, and unwilling to change. It was clean, it was compelling, and it left very little room for nuance. But Thomas Markle's claim introduces something the story never accounted for: foresight. Because foresight doesn't behave like emotion. It doesn't explode. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't improvise. It plans. And planning leaves fingerprints. Thomas says those fingerprints were visible early, not in dramatic blow-ups or tabloid scandals, but in small, easily dismissed signals. Comments made casually, expectations framed oddly. An unusual fixation on what comes after before what is happening now had even begun. Think about that. Most people entering a marriage, especially one under global scrutiny, are consumed by survival, adjustment, compromise, learning the rules of a new world. But according to Thomas, the focus wasn't survival. It was leverage. He claims there was an assumption, almost from the start, that the royal structure would bend. And if it didn't, that refusal would become useful. Useful how? In narrative. Because conflict isn't accidental when it benefits someone. And that's where the story takes a sharp turn away from what we've been told. For years, critics of the royal family argued that Meghan was overwhelmed, that the pressure was unbearable, that she was trapped inside a system designed to break outsiders. And yet, Thomas's claim suggests a different interpretation entirely. What if she wasn't trapped? What if she was testing the walls, testing how much resistance would appear, and how quickly that resistance could be framed as cruelty? Ask yourself this honestly. If someone truly intends to stay, their instinct is to adapt. If someone intends to leave, their instinct is to document. Document grievances, document moments of friction, document slights, real or perceived, because documentation becomes ammunition later. Thomas claims he noticed this pattern early, not as malice, but as preparation. And preparation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it waits. Now pause for a second and consider the role the public played in all of this. We were not just observers, we were participants. Because outrage doesn't generate itself. It requires witnesses, amplifiers, emotional investment. And if an exit plan relied on public sympathy, then public reaction was not incidental, it was essential. Which raises an uncomfortable question for every viewer of the saga. Were we watching a collapse or a construction? Because there's a difference between reacting to mistreatment and building a case. Thomas says the distinction matters. He claims there were conversations that made it clear the royal family was never viewed as a forever home, but as a chapter, one that needed to end dramatically enough to justify what came next. And what came next, of course, was independence, brand independence, narrative independence, financial independence. You can't build that cleanly if you simply leave quietly. You need a rupture, and ruptures require villains. That's where the monarchy comes in. According to Thomas, the institution was always going to be positioned as the antagonist, not because it necessarily deserved it, but because it was structurally incapable of defending itself emotionally. Institutions don't cry on camera. They don't give intimate interviews. They don't tell their side in first-person narratives, which makes them perfect. And once that dynamic was understood, The story almost wrote itself. But here's the part most people avoid talking about, because it complicates the emotional simplicity of the narrative. Harry. If the exit plan existed early, then his role becomes deeply ambiguous. Was he a co-architect, a willing collaborator, or someone who fell in love without realizing the destination had already been chosen? Thomas suggests the answer isn't flattering. He claims there was a moment, not public, not dramatic, when he realized Harry's understanding of the situation didn't match the reality unfolding around him. That realization, according to Thomas, is what ultimately silenced him. Because how do you speak when the truth would hurt the person you're trying to protect? How do you expose a plan when doing so might reveal that someone entered a marriage believing it was mutual, only to discover it wasn't? That's the emotional knot at the center of this story. And it's why Thomas didn't speak sooner. Because silence wasn't just about self-preservation, it was about timing. He knew if he spoke early, he would be dismissed as bitter, defensive, irrelevant. But if he waited, the contradictions would begin to speak for themselves. And that's exactly what happened. The speed of the exit, the precision of the messaging, the consistency of blame, the lack of self-reflection, all of it began to form a pattern. And patterns are harder to dismiss than accusations. Now, none of this means every grievance was fabricated. That's important to say clearly. Pain can be real and still be useful. Conflict can be genuine and still be leveraged. The question isn't whether suffering existed. The question is whether suffering was anticipated, because anticipation implies intent, and intent reshapes accountability. Thomas isn't asking the public to sympathize with him. He's asking them to reconsider the timeline, to rewind the tape, to look at the early moments not as innocent beginnings, but as signals. Why were exit narratives ready so quickly? Why did reconciliation never appear to be a serious goal? Why was permanence spoken about publicly, while contingency plans seemed to operate privately? These are not emotional questions. They're strategic ones. And strategy is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of choosing heroes and villains easily. It forces you to sit in uncertainty. It forces you to accept that more than one truth can exist at the same time. Thomas claims he accepted that long ago, that he understood his daughter was not evil, but ambitious, not malicious, but determined. And determination doesn't ask permission. It moves forward, even if people get hurt, especially if those people don't realize they're part of the plan. Which brings us to the most devastating implication of all. If the exit was planned early, then the wedding wasn't a promise of permanence. It was a launch into global recognition, a launch into legitimacy, a launch into a platform that could never be replicated any other way. And once that launch succeeded, staying became unnecessary. That interpretation may feel harsh, even cruel, but Thomas insists it's the only one that makes sense of everything that followed. The sudden certainty, the refusal to compromise, the scorched earth departures. You don't burn bridges you plan to cross again. You burn bridges when you're sure you won't need them. And that certainty, he claims, existed long before the world realized anything was wrong. But here's the detail Thomas says keeps him awake at night. He claims there was a specific moment, a phrase, a decision, a reaction that confirmed beyond doubt that the exit was inevitable. Not after the wedding, before it. And that moment didn't involve the press. It didn't involve the palace. It involved family. And once that moment passed, everything else became performance. Smiles, appearances, reassurances. All of it layered on top of a decision already made. And that decision, according to Thomas, set off a chain of events that would eventually isolate Harry from everyone he had ever known, while convincing him it was necessary for love. But what came next would reveal just how carefully the groundwork had been laid. Because the first public fracture didn't happen where anyone expected. And when it did, it exposed something no one was prepared to see. Why didn't he speak sooner? That question has followed Thomas Markle like a shadow for years. Louder than the tabloids. Louder than the pundits. Louder even than the accusations thrown his way. If he really knew something, anything, why wait? Why let the story harden? Why let reputations be ruined? Why allow a single narrative to dominate while his own voice faded into the background? Those are fair questions, necessary questions, and according to Thomas, they're the wrong ones. Because silence, he insists, wasn't absence. It was containment. To understand that, you have to rewind, not to the wedding, not to the engagement, not even to the early days of the relationship, but to the moment when he realized that speaking would cost more than staying quiet. Thomas says that moment arrived not with anger, but with clarity, a clarity that scared him. He wasn't watching a daughter stumble. He wasn't watching chaos unfold. He was watching momentum. And momentum, once it reaches a certain speed, doesn't respond to warnings. It responds to outcomes. Thomas describes himself at that stage not as an outsider, but as a man slowly being written out of a script he no longer recognized. Conversations shortened. Updates stopped. Tone shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just distance. And distance, when it arrives quietly, is often the most deliberate choice of all. For the public, Thomas became the problem, the embarrassing father, the unpredictable liability, the man whose presence complicated the fairy tale. And once that label stuck, everything he said or didn't say was filtered through it, which suited everyone involved. Because a discredited witness is the safest kind. Thomas says he realized this early, that no matter what he said, it would be reframed as bitterness, attention-seeking, or retaliation. So he stopped, not because he had nothing to say, but because saying it too soon would guarantee it was never heard. That decision, to wait, is the spine of this chapter, because waiting isn't passive. Waiting is strategic. Thomas claims he spent those years watching patterns emerge that eventually spoke louder than any interview could. The speed of decisions, the absence of reconciliation, the certainty with which bridges were burned, these were not the behaviors of someone hoping to stay. They were the behaviors of someone who had already left emotionally and was now arranging the narrative of departure. But try saying that in real time. Try saying that when the world is emotionally invested in a love story, you don't get thanked for nuance. You get buried. So Thomas waited. And in that waiting, he became something else entirely. A silent witness. He watched the media cycle repeat itself over and over again. Outrage, sympathy, affirmation, all reinforcing the same core idea, that everything happening was spontaneous, reactive, unavoidable. And yet, behind the scenes, he says the opposite felt true. Planned doesn't mean heartless. Planned doesn't mean fake. It means directional. It means knowing where you're headed, even if the people walking beside you don't. That's the part Thomas struggles with the most. Because the silence wasn't just about protecting himself, it was about protecting someone else. And that someone else was not the institution. It was Prince Harry. Thomas says he stayed quiet because he believed, for a long time, that Harry would eventually see what he saw. That time, reflection and emotional fallout would lead to reconciliation, or at least understanding. Speaking too early would have destroyed that possibility, so he bit his tongue. And when you bite your tongue long enough, people start to assume you have nothing to say. But silence has a cost. It isolates you. It allows other versions of you to take shape. And Thomas watched his own image be flattened into something unrecognizable, a caricature, a villain, the father who failed. What the public didn't see was the internal contradiction he lived with every day, knowing something, or believing you know something, that could reshape a global narrative, and choosing not to say it. That kind of silence doesn't feel noble. It feels suffocating. Thomas says there were nights he almost broke, moments when he considered going public, correcting the record, forcing a conversation. But then he would ask himself one question: would this help, or would it only make things worse? Because timing is everything in truth-telling. Speak too early, and you're dismissed. Speak too late, and you're accused of opportunism. There is no perfect moment. There is only the moment when silence becomes heavier than the consequences of breaking it. Thomas says that moment didn't come with a headline. It came with realization, a realization that the narrative had fully calcified, and that silence was no longer protecting anyone. Because by then, Harry wasn't just estranged from his family, he was isolated. Geographically, emotionally, narratively, everything he once knew had been reframed as toxic. Every connection he had was now conditional, and Thomas began to see something that unsettled him deeply. The exit hadn't just removed Meghan from the royal family, it had removed Harry from his entire past. That level of separation doesn't happen accidentally. It requires conviction. And conviction, Thomas believes, doesn't appear overnight. It's built slowly, carefully, deliberately. Which brings us back to the question that started this chapter. Why didn't he speak sooner? Because speaking sooner would have required accusing his own daughter of foresight, of planning. And no father wants to believe that about their child, let alone say it out loud. But time has a way of stripping illusions. And as the years passed, Thomas says the evidence became harder to ignore. The refusal to soften language, the insistence on moral absolutes, the absence of doubt. Doubt is what people feel when they're improvising. Certainty is what people feel when they're executing. And everything about the exit felt executed. That's when Thomas realized his silence was no longer neutral. It was enabling a version of events that erased complexity and protected one person at the expense of another. And that realization broke something in him. Because protecting your child should never require sacrificing someone else's reality, especially when that someone else didn't know the plan. That's when Thomas began preparing to speak. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but carefully. He didn't want to shout. He wanted to be heard, which meant waiting until the story itself began to crack. Until contradictions piled up. Until the audience, you, started asking questions the narrative couldn't answer. That's why he's speaking now. Not because it's convenient, but because it's finally possible. But there's one detail Thomas says he still hasn't shared publicly. A moment so early, so revealing, that once you hear it, the entire silence suddenly makes sense. A moment that explains not just why he stayed quiet, but why he knew, with chilling certainty, that the ending was already written. And that moment didn't happen in a palace. It happened in private, between family. And once you understand what was said, and when, the silence stops looking like avoidance, and starts looking like the only option he had left. That moment, the one Thomas says changed everything, wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no ultimatum. That's what makes it so unsettling. According to Thomas Markle, it was a calm statement delivered almost casually, as if the future were already settled. A sentence that didn't sound like doubt or fear or frustration, but certainty. Not if, not maybe, but when. He won't repeat the exact wording publicly. He says the words themselves aren't the point is the mindset behind them. He claims that in that moment, he realized something fundamental. This wasn't someone bracing for an uncertain future. This was someone speaking from a script already outlined in their head. And once you hear certainty like that, you don't unhear it. Thomas says he remembered thinking, almost involuntarily, this isn't how people talk when they're hoping to make something work. This is how people talk when they're deciding how something will end. That realization hit him hard, not because it felt malicious, but because it felt final. Parents know the difference between ambition and restlessness, between confidence and resolve. This wasn't restlessness, it was resolve. And that's when Thomas began to understand his role in the story was changing. He was no longer a sounding board, no longer a confidant. He was becoming an obstacle, not intentionally, but structurally. Because once a decision is made, anyone who questions it becomes inconvenient. So he pulled back, not out of anger, not out of resentment, out of instinct. He sensed that any pushback would only accelerate the distance, that asking too many questions would brand him as unsupportive, that expressing concern would be reframed as negativity, and in a narrative that requires unity, dissent is dangerous. Thomas says he saw this dynamic repeat itself again and again as the relationship progressed. Moments where nuance disappeared, moments where disagreement was interpreted as betrayal. moments where loyalty was measured by silence. That's not how families usually operate. But it is how campaigns do. And once that parallel entered his mind, he couldn't ignore it. Because campaigns don't tolerate unpredictability. They tighten circles, they control messaging, they neutralize loose ends. And Thomas, with his unpolished presence and unscripted honesty, was the loosest end of all. That's when the distance hardened into estrangement. Not overnight. Gradually. Phone calls became rare. Updates became filtered. Information arrived late, if at all. And when the public narrative began to take shape, Thomas noticed something else. There was no room in it for him. Not as a flawed father, not as a complicated human being, not even as a background character. He was simply removed. And removal is never accidental. Removal is strategic. The world saw this as cruelty, as rejection, as unnecessary harshness. Thomas saw it differently. He saw it as preparation, because when you're planning a clean break, you don't want emotional contradictions cluttering the story. A father who might contradict the timeline, a father who remembers earlier conversations, a father who noticed the planning before the pain. Those details don't help a clean narrative. So he became expendable. And that realization did something strange to Thomas. It didn't make him angry. It made him quiet. Because once you understand you're no longer part of the conversation, speaking feels pointless. He watched as the wedding approached, the spectacle, the symbolism, the global attention, and felt a growing sense of unreality. Everyone around him saw a beginning. He saw a midpoint. And that disconnect is isolating in a way that's hard to explain. Imagine watching a train depart while knowing the destination isn't what the passengers think it is, and realizing you're not allowed to warn them. That's how he describes it. Especially when it came to Prince Harry. Thomas says his feelings toward Harry were complicated, but sincere. He didn't see him as weak. He didn't see him as foolish. He saw him as emotionally open and emotionally invested. An emotional investment is dangerous when one side has already accepted an ending, because love assumes symmetry. Plans don't. Thomas claims he worried that Harry was entering a commitment believing it was mutual in its permanence, while the other side saw permanence as conditional. Conditional on treatment, conditional on optics, conditional on leverage. That imbalance is subtle at first. It shows up as decisiveness, confidence, direction. But over time, it becomes control. Not necessarily intentional, but inevitable. And that's what Thomas says he saw unfolding. As the royal environment proved less flexible than expected, frustration mounted, but not in a way that suggested disappointment, in a way that suggested confirmation. Confirmation that the structure would not bend. Confirmation that conflict would be inevitable. Confirmation that the narrative exit would justify itself. If you're truly hoping something works, resistance feels devastating. If you're expecting resistance, it feels validating. That distinction haunted Thomas, because everything he observed looked like validation, not heartbreak. And that's why he didn't rush to defend himself publicly when the narrative turned against him. Defensiveness would have signaled surprise. He wasn't surprised. He felt resigned. Resigned to the idea that the story was moving forward without him, and that trying to insert himself would only make things uglier. But resignation doesn't last forever. Eventually, it hardens into clarity, and clarity brings responsibility. Thomas says the moment that shifted him from silent witness to reluctant speaker came when he realized the narrative had crossed a line, not against him, against reality, when complexity disappeared entirely. When every event was flattened into good versus evil, when no mistake was mutual, when no compromise was possible. That's not how life works. And Thomas believes that when stories abandon complexity, they stop being honest. That's when silence becomes complicity. And he could no longer live with that. But here's the part that still troubles him the most. He says the plan he sensed early on didn't just involve leaving the royal family. It involved what came after. The framing, the positioning, the moral authority. Leaving quietly doesn't create that. Leaving dramatically does. And drama requires escalation, which means that once the plan was in motion, Reconciliation was never the goal. Distance was. Separation was. And eventually, isolation reframed everything Thomas had witnessed. The quickness of decisions, the refusal to soften language, the insistence on total alignment. Those weren't emotional reactions. They were structural necessities, and once he saw it that way, the silence finally made sense. He wasn't waiting for courage, he was waiting for proof. Proof that the pattern wasn't coincidental, proof that the exit wasn't spontaneous, proof that what felt inevitable had been anticipated all along, and over time, that proof accumulated, quietly, until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. Now Thomas says, the silence has served its purpose, because the questions the narrative can't answer anymore are the same questions he asked years ago, only now the public is asking them to. And that's the moment he was waiting for. But before anyone decides whether to believe him or not, there's something else you need to understand. The silence wasn't just about him. It was about something far more sensitive. Something that, if revealed too early, would have changed the entire trajectory of the story, and possibly destroyed a marriage before it even had a chance to exist. Because according to Thomas, there was one warning he never gave publicly. One concern he kept entirely private, and that concern involved the timing of the exit itself, because the timing, he says, was the most revealing part of all. And once you understand when the plan truly began, not publicly, but privately, the next chapter stops being about silence and starts being about pattern. The timing, that was the detail Thomas says he couldn't ignore anymore. Not what happened, not what was said publicly, but when certain decisions appeared to already be made. He claims that long before the world began asking whether royal life was sustainable, the internal conversation had already moved past that question. Sustainable wasn't the concern, narrative was. Because when people genuinely hope to make something work, time feels open-ended. There's patience, there's trial and error, there's a willingness to sit with discomfort. But when people are managing an exit, time becomes a resource. You don't waste it. Thomas says that was the giveaway. He noticed an urgency that didn't match the circumstances. A push to define conflicts early, to label experiences quickly, to lock interpretations in place before alternative explanations could surface. Think about it. Most people entering a powerful institution move cautiously. They test boundaries slowly. They adapt. But what Thomas observed felt inverted. Boundaries were tested immediately. Interpretations were fixed quickly, and disappointment appeared, almost on schedule. That's when he began to understand the importance of timing. Because if the exit were truly reactive, the story would have unfolded unevenly. There would have been hesitation, second thoughts, attempts at repair. Instead, Thomas says what he witnessed was decisiveness. And decisiveness is comforting until you realize it's directional. Once that clicked, the silence stopped feeling like weakness and started feeling like observation. He began watching not just events, but reactions to events. How quickly were grievances framed? How consistently were they reinforced? How rarely were they softened? Patterns emerged, and patterns don't need commentary to be convincing. They simply repeat. Thomas says there was never a single dramatic moment where he thought, this is fake. It was subtler than that. It was the absence of doubt. People improvising under stress contradict themselves. People executing a plan stay remarkably consistent. And consistency, over time, becomes conspicuous, especially when it's paired with moral certainty. Thomas noticed how early certainty appeared. Certainty about blame, about motives, about impossibility of reconciliation. That certainty didn't fluctuate, it hardened. And once certainty hardens, conversation ends. That's when Thomas realized something else. Speaking wouldn't change the outcome. It would only change the optics. And optics were already being managed far more carefully than truth. So he stayed quiet. And that quiet, he says, was misinterpreted. The world saw indifference. He felt containment, because if he spoke then, the message would have been lost inside the noise of outrage and allegiance. Timing, again, mattered. He waited for the moment when the story would begin to contradict itself. not emotionally, but structurally. When the same talking points repeated without evolution, when grievances no longer escalated but recycled, when distance became permanent instead of painful, that's when silence stopped protecting anyone. Because permanence changes responsibility. If something is temporary, silence can be mercy. If something is permanent, silence becomes distortion. Thomas says the permanence arrived quietly. No announcement, no acknowledgement. Just an unspoken understanding that return was no longer an option. And once that understanding settled in, he knew the story would never correct itself on its own. It had reached narrative equilibrium. Hero, villain, escape. There was no room left for complexity. That's the moment Thomas decided he would eventually have to speak. Not to attack, not to vindicate himself, but to reintroduce uncertainty. Because uncertainty is the enemy of propaganda, and certainty, when it goes unchallenged, becomes dangerous. He didn't rush, he didn't call press conferences. He waited for the public to notice the cracks. And slowly, they did. Why were the same grievances repeated years later without resolution? Why was reconciliation never framed as desirable? Why did every conflict confirm the same conclusion? Those questions didn't come from Thomas. They came from observers who no longer felt satisfied with simple answers. That's when he understood the silence had done its work. Because now, when he speaks, he's not introducing doubt, he's responding to it. And that difference matters. Thomas is careful not to claim omniscience. He doesn't say he knew every detail. He doesn't say he predicted every outcome. What he says is simpler and more troubling. He recognized intent, and intent doesn't require a full blueprint to be real. It requires direction. Direction toward departure. Direction toward separation. Direction toward a future built outside the institution. And once that direction was set, everything else aligned accordingly. Even pain, especially pain. Because pain, when framed correctly, becomes justification. And justification is essential when you're leaving something powerful behind. Thomas says he understands why many people reject his claims instinctively. It's easier to believe in chaos than in calculation. Chaos preserves innocence. Calculation demands accountability. And accountability is uncomfortable when emotions are involved. But discomfort doesn't make something false. It just makes it inconvenient. And Thomas has spent years living with inconvenience. Watching the world argue about motives without ever discussing timing. Watching people analyze reactions without questioning intentions. Watching a story harden into myth. That's why he stayed quiet. Not because he lacked something to say, but because he wanted the silence to speak first. And now, he believes it has. But before this story can move forward, there's something else that needs to be examined. Something even more unsettling than silence. Because if this pattern didn't begin with Harry, then where did it begin? Thomas suggests the royal relationship wasn't the first time he noticed this trajectory. He believes it was simply the largest stage it ever played out on, which means the next chapter isn't about the monarchy at all. It's about repetition. Because once you recognize a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. And according to Thomas, the signs were there long before anyone thought to look. What if the royal story wasn't the first time this trajectory appeared? What if it was simply the first time it unfolded on a stage big enough for the whole world to watch? That's the question Thomas says he couldn't escape once the pattern finally snapped into focus. Because patterns don't announce themselves the first time. They whisper, they repeat, they normalize. And by the time they're obvious, most people are too emotionally invested to want to see them. According to Thomas, the mistake many observers make is assuming everything began with Meghan Markle meeting Prince Harry. He insists that's not where the story starts. That's where it scales. Before the palace gates. Before the protocols. Before the titles, there were earlier cycles, smaller, quieter ones, that followed a familiar rhythm. Intense commitment. Rapid identity shift. Escalating dissatisfaction. Clean exit. Not chaos. Sequence. Thomas doesn't describe these moments as malicious or deceptive. He describes them as directional, driven by an internal certainty about what comes next. And certainty is powerful, especially when paired with ambition. He says that long before royalty entered the picture, He noticed how endings were often framed not as failures, but as inevitabilities. How departure was positioned as growth. How distance was justified as self-preservation. Those narratives weren't wrong, but they were consistent. And consistency, over time, becomes instructive. Thomas began asking himself questions most parents avoid. Why does dissatisfaction arrive so quickly after achievement? Why does reinvention always require rupture? Why is the past so often reframed as limiting once it's left behind? These aren't accusations, they're observations, and he admits that for a long time, he didn't want to connect them. Parents want to believe each chapter is unique, that every ending has its own context. That growth explains everything. But patterns don't care what we want, they persist. Thomas says the royal relationship mirrored earlier arcs in one crucial way: speed. The speed of emotional investment, the speed of public positioning, the speed of certainty. Everything moved quickly, faster than most people could process, and that velocity itself became proof of sincerity. If something moves fast, it must be real. If it's intense, it must be genuine. That assumption is comforting. But intensity can also be directional. It can push people forward before they've asked where they're going. Thomas says he recognized that feeling early, the sense that momentum itself was doing the work, and momentum doesn't pause for reflection. That's why dissent feels like sabotage when momentum is high. Anyone who slows things down becomes an obstacle. Anyone who asks for patience becomes unsupportive. And that dynamic, Thomas says, existed long before the royal family entered the frame, which is why he reacted differently than the public did when things began to fracture. The public saw a shocking collapse. He saw acceleration toward a familiar ending. The royal institution didn't create that dynamic. It amplified it, because institutions don't bend easily. And when they resist, resistance becomes evidence. Evidence that staying was impossible. Evidence that leaving was necessary. Thomas says this is where many people misunderstand his claim. He's not saying the institution was blameless, he's saying the conflict wasn't unexpected. There's a difference. Unexpected conflict creates confusion. Expected conflict creates validation. And validation feels reassuring when you're already oriented toward departure. Thomas noticed how quickly moments of friction were interpreted as confirmation. There was no sense of, maybe we need more time. It was, this proves what we already knew. And that framing didn't evolve, it intensified. Which is why Thomas began revisiting earlier moments in his mind, not to assign blame, but to understand trajectory. He saw the same emotional rhythm repeat. Hope, frustration, reframing, exit. Each time, the exit wasn't mourned, it was justified. That's an important distinction. People who leave reluctantly grieve what they're losing. People who leave intentionally explain why leaving was right. Thomas says the explanations always came easily. Too easily. And ease, when it comes to endings, can be revealing. That doesn't mean there was no pain. Pain can coexist with planning. But the planning shapes how pain is expressed. It gives it language. It gives it direction. It gives it an audience. And once the audience is involved, the narrative hardens. Thomas believes the royal story followed this arc with unprecedented visibility. What once happened privately now unfolded globally, which meant every familiar step felt new to those watching for the first time. But to him, it felt recognizable. That recognition is what frightened him, because recognition means predictability, and predictability means the outcome was never in doubt. He remembers thinking, if this follows the same trajectory, then the ending won't be reconciliation. It will be separation framed as survival, and that framing leaves no room for shared responsibility, only for heroes and villains. Thomas says that's why he struggled with how quickly moral clarity arrived. Complex situations don't produce immediate moral certainty. They produce ambivalence. They produce confusion. They produce regret. But the royal exit produced conviction. Conviction that the institution was irredeemable. Conviction that staying was impossible. Conviction that departure was the only ethical choice. Those are strong conclusions to reach quickly. unless you were already oriented toward them. That's when Thomas began asking a harder question. Was the relationship meant to change the institution or to expose it? Because those are very different goals. One requires patience, the other requires conflict. And conflict, once you need it, will always find a way. That doesn't mean grievances were fabricated. It means they were interpreted through a specific lens, a lens that turned friction into proof. Thomas says that once he saw this, he understood why earlier warnings, even gentle ones, were unwelcome. They threatened the lens. They introduced ambiguity, and ambiguity weakens momentum. So they were ignored. That realization hurt more than public criticism ever could, because it meant the outcome wasn't slipping out of control. It was unfolding as expected. And expectation changes how you respond to obstacles. You don't negotiate with them. You move through them. That's what Thomas believes happened. And that belief reframed everything for him. The speed, the certainty, the lack of hesitation. None of it looked like panic. It looked like execution, which is why, when the public narrative framed the exit as sudden and shocking, Thomas felt a strange disconnect. Because for him, it wasn't shocking at all. It was familiar, and familiarity strips drama of its power. It turns spectacle into sequence. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because recognizing a pattern doesn't mean understanding its origin. Thomas admits he doesn't know exactly when this trajectory first formed. He only knows that by the time Harry entered the picture, it was already active, which raises an unsettling question. If the royal relationship wasn't the beginning, what was? And more importantly, if the pattern was already in motion, what role did Harry truly play in it? Because patterns don't need permission to repeat. They just need opportunity. And the opportunity royalty provided was unlike anything before. Global attention, institutional resistance, moral contrast, everything a dramatic exit requires. Which means the next chapter isn't about blaming the monarchy. It's about understanding how the pattern found its perfect stage. And once you see that stage clearly, the rest of the story starts to look far less spontaneous than anyone wants to admit. It reveals them. That's how Thomas frames it now. Quietly, carefully, without the sharp edges people expect. He doesn't speak like someone settling scores. He speaks like someone finally connecting dots. He spent years refusing to connect, because no parent wants to believe their child is repeating a cycle, especially one that leaves people behind. Thomas says that once he accepted the possibility of a pattern, memories he'd filed away as unrelated began to rearrange themselves. Moments that once felt isolated started lining up. Not in a sinister way, in a structural one. He recalls earlier transitions that followed a familiar emotional rhythm, periods of intense focus, reinvention, forward momentum. And then, once the goal was reached, a rapid reframing of what came before. The past wasn't just left, it was explained away, as limiting, as unsupportive, as incompatible with growth. That framing is powerful. It protects the person leaving from doubt. It turns departure into progress. But Thomas noticed something subtle over time. The framing always pointed outward. Circumstances changed. Environments failed. Others didn't understand. Rarely did it point inward, and when accountability consistently points in one direction, it shapes expectation. It conditions you to believe the next environment will finally be different, until it isn't. Thomas says that's why the royal relationship felt less like a gamble and more like a culmination. It wasn't entering something unknown. It was entering something larger, a bigger stage, a bigger platform, a bigger contrast. And contrast is essential if you want your exit to matter. He's careful here, almost hesitant, because he knows how this sounds. People want clear villains, clear intentions, clear proof. But human behavior rarely offers that. Instead, it offers repetition. And repetition, Thomas says, was the real signal. He remembers how quickly certainty appeared once the royal world pushed back. Not sadness, not confusion, certainty. Certainty that the environment was toxic. Certainty that staying would be harmful. Certainty that leaving was the only ethical option. Those conclusions arrived fast. too fast to be born entirely of surprise. And once again, Thomas found himself watching momentum do the work. Momentum toward separation. Momentum toward distance. Momentum toward a future already envisioned. He began to realize that the monarchy didn't cause the exit, it validated it. And validation feels like relief when you've already prepared to go. That's an important distinction. People who are blindsided by adversity scramble. People who expect it settle into it. Thomas says the reactions he witnessed felt settled, not panicked. Settled, which is why he struggled with the way the public interpreted events. They saw shock. He saw confirmation. They saw collapse. He saw alignment. That doesn't mean there wasn't real pain. It means the pain didn't redirect the trajectory. It reinforced it. Thomas admits that for a long time he blamed himself for noticing this and doing nothing. He wondered if speaking earlier could have changed anything. But over time, he came to a harder conclusion. The pattern didn't require his approval. It didn't require his participation. It simply moved forward, which meant the royal relationship was never just about love or conflict. It was about scale. Scale of visibility. Scale of influence. Scale of consequence. And once you understand that, the speed makes sense. The intensity makes sense. Even the finality makes sense. Because when a pattern finally finds its perfect stage, it doesn't hesitate. It performs. Thomas says this realization forced him to confront a painful truth, that the royal institution was never the goal. It was the contrast. And contrast requires friction. That doesn't mean friction was fabricated. It means friction was inevitable and useful. Useful for explaining departure. Useful for rallying support. Useful for establishing moral authority. And once moral authority is established, the past becomes unchallengeable. That's when Thomas knew silence wouldn't hold forever. Because once a narrative hardens, the only thing that can soften it is time, or contradiction. Time had passed. Contradictions were emerging. The pattern was becoming visible to others. And that's why this chapter matters. Not because it proves intent, but because it explains inevitability. Thomas doesn't claim there was a conscious checklist titled Exit Plan. He claims something more subtle and more unsettling. An orientation, a forward-facing orientation that treated each environment as provisional, as a means, not an end. And once an environment stops serving the next version of yourself, leaving feels justified, even necessary. That orientation existed before royalty. Royalty just magnified it, and magnification is dangerous because it makes patterns look unprecedented, when in reality, they're just louder. Thomas says the hardest part of accepting this wasn't what it said about his daughter, it was what it implied about Harry. Because if the pattern was already active, then Harry didn't create it. He entered it. And people entering patterns rarely see them for what they are. They experience them as passion, as destiny, as urgency, which is why Thomas says he worries less about blame and more about awareness. Because patterns don't need villains to hurt people. They just need momentum. And momentum, once it carries two people at different speeds, creates imbalance. One person is catching up. The other is already looking ahead. That imbalance doesn't show immediately. It hides behind intensity. It hides behind unity. It hides behind the rush of a shared cause. But eventually, it reveals itself in decision-making. Who hesitates? Who doesn't? Who doubts? Who reframes doubt as betrayal? Thomas believes that's what happened. And once he saw it that way, the story stopped being about one relationship. It became about repetition on a global scale. Which is why the next phase unfolded exactly as the earlier ones had. Just louder. Distance reframed as protection. Criticism reframed as persecution. Exit reframed as survival. Those reframes weren't invented by the royal conflict. They were activated by it. That's what Thomas wants people to understand. This wasn't chaos. It was continuity. And continuity, once recognized, changes how you interpret everything that follows. Because if the royal relationship was the culmination of a pattern, then the most important question isn't why it failed. It's why it succeeded at doing exactly what the pattern required, creating a dramatic, morally charged exit that left no room for return. That's not tragedy. That's trajectory. And once trajectory is clear, the next chapter stops being about the past. It becomes about awareness, because if a pattern could reach this scale once, it can shape everything that comes after. Which brings us to the next question, the one Thomas says haunted him most. If the pattern didn't begin with Harry and it didn't end with the monarchy, then what exactly did Harry walk into? And more importantly, when did he realize he wasn't walking toward a future, but into the final act of something already in motion? What exactly did Harry walk into, and when did the door quietly close behind him? Thomas says the answer begins with the engagement, not as a romantic milestone, but as a structural one. Because engagements don't just signal love, they lock trajectories. Once an engagement is public, momentum accelerates. Doubt becomes expensive. Reversal becomes humiliating. And every step forward feels irreversible. That's why engagements matter so much in narratives. They convert intention into expectation. According to Thomas, this is where the pattern hardened. Before the engagement, everything was flexible, hypothetical, adjustable. After the engagement, everything became performative. Not fake, performative. There's a difference. Performance doesn't mean insincere. It means public. And once something is public, it stops belonging only to the people involved. It belongs to the audience. Thomas says he noticed the shift immediately. The language changed. Conversations stopped revolving around possibility and started revolving around optics. How things would look, how moments would be received, how reactions would be framed. That's when he realized the engagement wasn't just a commitment to marriage. It was a commitment to narrative. And narratives, once engaged, don't like ambiguity. They want direction. Thomas remembers watching the engagement interview, like everyone else, smiling, polished, intimate, and feeling a strange sense of dissonance. Not because it looked wrong, because it looked finished. There was no uncertainty, no nervousness, no sense of discovery. It felt resolved. And resolution, that early, made him uneasy. Engagements usually come with hope and anxiety intertwined. This one came with certainty. Certainty about values. Certainly about incompatibility with the institution. Certainly about what would and would not be tolerated. That certainty was presented as confidence. But Thomas heard something else in it. Finality. He noticed how early the framing of us versus them appeared, even before them had done much of anything. Institutions were described as rigid, traditions as outdated, boundaries as oppressive. And while those critiques aren't inherently wrong, Thomas noticed the timing. They arrived before immersion, before adjustment, before compromise had even been attempted. That's unusual. Most people criticize systems after trying to live inside them. This critique arrived in advance, which made Thomas wonder whether disappointment was anticipated. Because anticipated disappointment hurts less and justifies more. He recalls thinking privately that the engagement felt less like a promise to endure and more like a declaration of terms. And terms, once declared, are difficult to renegotiate, especially when millions of people are watching. Thomas says the engagement locked something else in place as well. Expectation of inevitability. Once the public embraced the couple as symbols of modernity and change, the pressure shifted. It was no longer about whether the institution could adapt. It was about proving whether it deserved to. That's a dangerous standard, because institutions rarely change on demand. They resist, and resistance under those conditions becomes proof. Proof that staying was impossible, proof that departure was justified. Thomas believes the engagement created a self-fulfilling structure. The more change was demanded publicly, the more resistance was likely privately. And the more resistance appeared, the more validated the exit narrative became. Everyone played their part. The public cheered progress. The institution guarded tradition. The couple embodied contrast. And contrast is combustible. That's why Thomas describes the engagement as the point of no return. Not because marriage followed, but because roles solidified. Once those roles were cast, the ending became predictable. Heroic departure, institutional villainy, moral clarity. The only variable left was timing. Thomas says this is where Harry's position became precarious, because while he was emotionally committed, he was also structurally trapped. Backing out would have meant betraying love. Moving forward meant inheriting the trajectory. And most people, when faced with that choice, choose love, especially when love feels urgent. Urgency is persuasive. It convinces you that hesitation equals doubt. And doubt, in a public narrative, is dangerous. Thomas believes Harry mistook momentum for mutuality. He saw intensity and assumed alignment. But alignment requires shared uncertainty. This felt like shared direction, with one person setting it. That doesn't mean Harry wasn't enthusiastic. It means enthusiasm doesn't equal authorship. And once the engagement was announced, authorship shifted. The story began telling itself. The public began projecting. The media began framing. The institution began bracing. And within that swirl, individual agency shrinks. You stop asking, is this working? You start asking, how do we manage what's happening? Thomas noticed how quickly the conversation moved from how will this work to how do we survive this. Survival language arrived early. Too early. And survival language implies threat. Threat implies harm. And harm demands response. That chain reaction, Thomas says, began at the engagement. Because the engagement didn't just announce love, it announced opposition. Opposition to tradition, opposition to restraint, opposition to gradualism. And opposition, once declared, must be sustained. Otherwise, it looks hollow. That's why Thomas believes the engagement didn't create pressure to stay. It created pressure to confront. And confrontation narrows options. You either win or you leave. There is no quiet middle ground. Thomas says this is where his concern for Harry deepened. Because Harry, by temperament, values belonging, family, cohesion, loyalty. Confrontation puts those values at risk. But once confrontation becomes part of the public identity of a relationship, stepping away from it feels like surrender. So Harry pressed forward. And pressing forward felt like strength. But strength under these conditions meant committing to a path with diminishing alternatives. Thomas doesn't accuse Harry of ignorance. He believes Harry trusted the direction because it was framed as moral. Moral causes feel safe. They make sacrifice feel meaningful, and meaning can blind you to exit routes. That's why the engagement mattered more than the wedding. The wedding was ceremonial. The engagement was structural. It set expectations that couldn't be walked back without cost. Cost to reputation. Cost to narrative. Cost to identity. And once costs are visible, people double down. Thomas believes that's exactly what happened. The engagement locked the exit in place not by announcing it, but by making its opposite untenable. Staying would have required compromise. Compromise would have looked like defeat. And defeat doesn't fit a heroic narrative, so the path narrowed. Stay and lose moral clarity, or leave and preserve it. Once framed that way, the choice becomes obvious, and obvious choices feel inevitable. Which brings us to the most chilling part of Thomas's account. He says there was a moment shortly after the engagement, not public, not recorded, when he realized the decision matrix had closed. When he understood that no matter how events unfolded, the ending would look the same. Only the justification would change. If the institution adapted, it would still be too little too late. If it resisted, it would prove the point. Either way, departure remained validated. That's when Thomas says he knew the engagement wasn't just a promise. It was a lock. And once locked, the only remaining question was how dramatic the unlocking would need to be. Because the bigger the stage, the cleaner the break. And royalty is the biggest stage of all. But the engagement did one more thing Thomas didn't fully grasp until later. It transformed personal conflict into public obligation. Once the public invested emotionally, leaving quietly would feel like betrayal. Betrayal of supporters. Betrayal of symbolism. Betrayal of expectation. So the exit couldn't be quiet. It had to be meaningful. And meaning, in public narratives, is built on contrast and consequence, which meant that whatever came next had to escalate. Tension, fracture, separation. And that escalation, Thomas believes, was not an accident. It was the only way the story could end without contradicting itself. But what he didn't anticipate was how quickly that escalation would begin. Because the first real rupture didn't wait for the wedding. It began before the vows were spoken. In subtle ways, in expectations that couldn't be met, in standards that couldn't be satisfied, and in a growing certainty that compromise was not the goal. Which is where the next chapter takes us, because once the engagement locked the exit in place, the wedding itself became something else entirely. Not a beginning, but a performance.